Hello everyone, my name is Regina Hyacinth Parco, and we will talk about the scientific model by Joel Black. So let's start with poetic metaphors and scientific models. The century and a half preceding the Romantic period was marked not only by an unprecedented succession of major scientific discoveries, but also by the rise of entirely new domain of scientific knowledge. From Newtonian mechanics to chemistry, from biology to psychology, each new field disclosed natural phenomena that were increasingly inaccessible to ordinary human observation. Such phenomena had to be apprehended through technological innovations, like telescopes or microscopes, and were often only comprehended through the use of mathematical formulas and conceptual models. Wordsworth described poetry as the impassioned expression which is in the countenance of all science. Coleridge is one of the earliest examples of poetic image of nature in which God, that all-pervasive intellectual breeze, directly participates. It is impossible to stand outside this model, to invoke God or to employ through as a means of considering nature objectively. It is unclear whether Coleridge's image of the organic harps is merely a poetic metaphor or a metaphysical model. When Romantic writers employed involuted poetic metaphors like Oy and Lyre, they were not indulging in witty conceits of the metaphysical poets. Organic form. Romantic critics exploited the analogy between the poetic artifact and the physical organism. Coleridge contrasts form that is mechanical when on any given material we impress a predetermined form with organic form that is innate. It's shaped as it develops itself from within. So, the concept of organic unity, dating back to Plato, lay behind the concept of unity in which a work's parts agree with each other and with the whole. By stressing the subjective aspect of organic form that pertain to issues of growth, Coleridge downplayed the concept other aspects of wholeness, assimilation, eternality, and interdependence. He may well be content to confine his appeal to a very purified post-Kantian version of the aesthetic properties. How we apply these models plays a large part in determining our understanding of Romanticism. For better or for worse, we are heirs not only to their concept of their organic form, but to their symbolic and analogical habits of thinking. Nature philosophy, metaphysical models of nature. The Romantic extensive use of metaphysical models in their artistic and scientific endeavors followed Kant's claim that the natural sciences rested on metaphysical foundations. The post-Kantian move, inaugurated by Fichte, who held that the material world is posited by an unconscious act of the productive imagination, was extended by Schelling in the characteristically romantic brand of science known as nature philosophy. In Van der Waals' he reduced Kant's primal polarity of attraction and repulsion to that of weight and light. From this, all the other polar forces found in nature were derived: magnetism, electricity, chemical reactions, organic and even physical activities. While nature philosophy provided a philosophical rationale for key Romantic concepts like organic form and dynamic polarities, Today, these views are generally considered scientifically untenable, if not bizarre. The notion that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that the organism's embryological development parallels to species evolutionary history become an accepted doctrine in 19th century thought. Perceptions of a developmental parallel between individual and species are evident in Romantic culture theories. In the New Science, Giambattista Vico maintained that the only object that human being can hope to know with any certainty and completeness are the artifacts and institutions they themselves have made. Imaginative metaphysics is a primitive mythic science, an interim forum of knowledge based on poetic tropes and psychic defenses. In our own time, Harold Bloom has concisely expressed with Frisian insight in his observation that poetry is born of our ignorance of causes. Romanticism can be said to have sponsored such scientific ideologies as organism developmentalism, vital materialism, and deep psychism. The ultimate aspiration for many romantics was to unify organic and psychic processes into a single conceptual system. So, the relationship between romantic criticism and the sciences can be clarified by reviewing the situation of biology and psychology at the beginning of the 19th century. The biological model. Goethe's concept in the 1780s of the Orphanlose and the Urtier were attempts to formulate an ideal plan for the vast diversity of flowering plants and vertebrate animals. As a primal form or image, the Orbild is a strange combination of what Clifford Geertz has called models for and models of reality. Somewhat like a genetic program, it achieves the communication of pattern in living creatures by incorporating a fundamental reproducible code or plan. In short, Goethe may be said to have combined a topological with a tropological insight, a recognition of the need in science for figural, the visual and experiential, as opposed to abstract, metric models, and figurative, a verbal and metaphorical as opposed to exact mathematical language. Next, we have the models of the mind, the romantic unconscious. When biology was superseded by the cell as a science of life, it ceased to be a romantic science. The Romantics were poised midway between Newton and Freud, and the discovery of the life sciences was a pivotal point of transition between the established physical sciences and the emerging human sciences. Beyond their interest in the new science of biology, the Romantics introduced a active approach to knowledge in which human beings, or human consciousness, were themselves the subject of biohistories. The Romantics' e-courts was an attempt to overcome the Enlightenment dialectic that set myth and reason in opposition to one another. Their investigation a century before Freud into the mind's vast unconscious processes. They discovered that the unconscious had a structure, a discovery that informed their imaginative and critical writings and was essential for establishing psychology and psychiatry as genuine sciences. Some of the most striking insight into the unconscious that were later developed in psychoanalytic theory can be found in the Romantics' imaginative writings. The Romantics anticipated psychoanalysis and the other human sciences through the genetic approach they brought to scientific study. We have seen that as ideal organic types behind Goethe's idea of metamorphosis, the Orphalancy and the Ortyr themselves underwent a transformation in his thinking, eventually becoming the Orphanomen in his work on color theory. The Orphantasy of Freud is the modern equivalent of Goethe's concept of the Orphanomen in the natural sciences, which Ellen Berger calls the basic concept of Romantic philosophy. In describing primal fantasies as psychogenetic inheritance that transcends the individual's own experience, Freud represents the culmination of the Romantic tradition of German science that aimed at the unfolding of generative history of nature through an original intuition. Let's move on to the models of sexuality. In this model, sexual knowledge is more than a metaphor for scientific knowledge. It is quite simply the earliest form of knowledge. In Genesis and Milton's Paradise, the primal sin in Eden was concerned less with scientific knowledge in any developed sense than with a primitive act of sexual awareness. The title of Byron's poem makes it clear he had the rake's sexual progress in mind as well as the scientist's cognitive advancement. And in the 18th century, French philosopher Oken argued that sex was foreseen from the beginning as a sacred bond that preserves all of nature, and that whoever denies sex does not grasp the mystery of the universe. So, in Romantic natural philosophy, sexuality was often seen as natural because it was productive, and cosmogony itself was described as a metaphysical act of procreation. Romantic argued that sexual union was the only means of recovering androgynous totality after the fall of Adam, when God separated the sexes and gave them bestial members for propagation. Jacob Boehme's theosophy was influential in this regard, revealing the original sin in Eden as a second fall, following the more significant lapse brought about when Adam sought to know his female half, which is Sophia. As a result of Adam's lust, God separated the sexes and gave them bestial members for propagation. In his romantic adaptation of Boehme's schema, Franz von Baader valorized human sexual union as the only means of recovering androgynous totality. Far from regarding sexuality as lust, which, through the agency of a woman, had caused the fall of a man, many romantics envisioned an erotics of creation whereby men and women could achieve reunion and redemption. And once sexuality was no longer stigmatized as the earliest instance of humanity's sinful desire for scientific knowledge, it could become a field of scientific investigation in its own right. The Romantic revolution in scientific views of sexuality began with Linnaeus's classification of plants and led to an awareness of the distinctiveness of the two sexes. While reinforcing gender stereotypes, it made it possible to re-examine the relation between procreation and sexual pleasure specifically in women and to reject the traditional views that rape was incompatible with pregnancy and that a woman cannot conceive unless she doth consent. While the church view of sexual relation was revised by writers like Schlegel and Novalis, it was not religious zealots who were most opposed to romantic views of love or who were obsessed with procreation. In their radical, quasi-scientific skepticism, Sade and Schopenhauer posed a greater challenge to the romantic sanguine views of sexuality than any repressive, religious, or cultural regime. These pornographic and paranoid extremes lie at the margins of conventional romantic visions of sexuality as creative and redemptive activity. In the last few chapters of our series on Romanticism, we have looked at how an array of quasi-scientific concepts, organic form, polar contraries, primal phenomena, and the dynamic unconscious inform the poetic and critical discourse of Romanticism. A, a critical reading of the Romantics need to attend to these models which underpin many of the key images found in literary texts of the period. The scientific models which the Romantics borrowed from the physical sciences have been the foundation of the relatively new disciplinary field called the human sciences. And we should not forget that one of these new fields of study was the institutionalization of literary study as an academic discipline, namely literary criticism itself. Thank you for listening. Goodbye and God bless.